And I want to start with a challenge. I've got a small challenge for everybody. And I want to ask you all to cast your minds back in time, to see if you can remember where you were when you first heard the news of that terrible tsunami that struck Southeast Asia. You remember that? I mean, if you're a millennial, you've got no chance. We're talking ancient history, and that was Boxing Day 2004, the day after Christmas. And you remember that? Well, thank you. Thank you. Well, 2 weeks after it struck, I found myself volunteering for a small team. But unlike you, Dan, I didn't have a clue what I was doing. Seriously, I was, young and naive, like keen to save the world and all of that. I didn't have a clue what was going on. I probably shouldn't have been there, if I'm totally honest. But for a farm boy from the bush in outback Australia, and actually I know there's two other Australians here. There was Sean and Colin. There's Colin over there. Even they haven't heard of Dubbo. It's this tiny little town. Sean, mate, you're from Melbourne. Nobody in Melbourne's heard of Dubbo. And look, Dubbo is the kind of place, right, that if you get a chance to go to Australia and they're like, hey, do you want to take a trip to Dubbo? Just keep on going. Just keep on going. But for a farm boy from outback in Dubbo, I'd never seen anything like this. I mean, it was just complete devastation. And I'll never forget the sights and the sounds and the smells. And standing where I took this photograph, standing on this pile of wreckage, this mound of rubble, I found this. I don't know if you can see it, but it's just a little plastic teddy bear, a little child's toy. And if you just stop and think for a second about the kind of stories that it would have to share, if you just pass that around, you'll get a bit of a sense of what I mean. And I reckon that for me, standing on that mound of rubble, that's when the light bulb really went on. And I realized that working with people affected by disaster and conflict was what mattered to me, was what I needed to do. And now, 15 years later, I run an organization called Wasafiri. And I'm delighted that my dear friend and the chairman of our board, Ian Randall's here, come up from Asheville. And I'm also delighted to say that one of Fred's sponsors, Dave Williams and Impact International, helped co-found Wasafiri as a social enterprise. And the funny thing is, in the West, in the States, people are like, Wasa what? What's the theory? What is this thing? But in East Africa, people get it. And Wasafiri is Swahili for travelers or explorers or pioneers. And our mission is to help tackle complex problems. Problems like conflict and climate change and violent extremism. And I know that's not everybody's cup of tea, but I find it compelling. And I find it rich with insights into the realities of operating in some pretty tough environments. But it also means, of course, that I know very little about your worlds. I've had some amazing insights over the last couple of days, make no mistake. So I'm certainly not going to pretend to offer any silver bullets or magic solutions. So we should also put that on the table right from the very beginning. But so, as a result, I'd like to start with a question. And it's a question I spent a long time thinking about in Sierra Leone, working on the Ebola crisis. What holds you back? What holds you back? Not your clients, not your teams, not your seniors. What holds you back? Guy, what's holding you back from confronting the university system in the UK at a time that desperately needs it? That's what I want to know. And I'd love to know in 3 to 6 months' time how much progress you're making. What holds us back from being the most significant and transformative and influential leaders that you want to be? I think it's such an important question. We talk a lot about VUCA, right? So is it something about the volatility and the uncertainty and the complexity of the world out there? Or is it something about who you are? Something much more personal, something within. So stay with that thought, because we'll come back to it. And I was just thinking that what I really want to do with this presentation is to take you with me into my world. And just for a short time, we'll have a look at some of the moments that have come to define leadership in my world, and we'll dig a bit deeper. and we'll try to unearth some of the questions that I've been forced to confront in a whole host of different situations. But when I was thinking about it, that's not really what this is all about. You know, I'll tell my story and all that, it's cool, but that's not really what this is all about. You see, my real aim for this presentation is to encourage you to reflect much more deeply on your own experience, your own truth, your own story. Because I believe that as leaders, you know, our truth, that's where our truth lies. You know, with all the gifts and the talents and the limitations that you bring. And I believe that that's the place to go to for the most powerful and the most authentic insights into who you are. You know, and what you bring to your challenge of being the voice of inclusion. And I'm looking at you, Debjani. You know, what's holding you back? And I know it's the fear of persecution and retribution, and I understand that. Particularly when your husband is working in an open carry university. I'd never heard of this phrase. How many people here have never heard the phrase open carry university? Right, either had I. So open carry university means that if you're a student, you can openly carry a pistol. What the hell is that all about? So no wonder you and your family live in fear of being too open, too bold, too provocative in what you have to say. But what's your truth, you know? That's it, you know, it was Kate, my dear friend, she's on our board. She hit me with this question 2 weeks ago when I was thinking about this. And she's like, yeah, you go and tell your own story. But what's your truth, Hamish? I'm like, oh shit, I thought I was just gonna come in here and tell a few stories. You know, and she just nailed me right between the eyes. It's such a beautiful question, it's so powerful. And you can't duck and run from it. So that's what this is all about. You know, I believe that our experience and our stories, you know, that's where our most authentic insights are about who we are and what we bring to our practice as leaders. So that's it. That's what this is really all about. But before we go any further, I should just ask, has anybody here served in the military? I know, Dan, you have. Tom, you certainly have. Jim, we've got a couple of people here. And Dan, you were in the Navy, right? Tom, Army. Jim? Air Force. Well, I don't know how it is in your organisations, but in the Australian military, there's an unwritten rule that in any seminar or workshop, if you feel a yawn coming on, you've got to leap out of your chair and start doing as many push-ups as you can. And I know it's been a long couple of days and there's been an enormous amount of energy here in this room. So if anybody feels the blood pooling around your ankles, Kathleen, I'm watching you. You got to like start doing some star jumps, some sit-ups, whatever it might be. Whatever works for you, go for it. Now I want to set the scene by showing you something I find fascinating. Now if you take a look at this, if you don't know it, it's a map produced by the World Economic Forum in its Global Risks Report. And it produces one every year. And it sets out what it sees to be the major risks facing the planet in the coming year. And of course, many of these will be very familiar to you all living and operating in this part of the world. Having been with you all for the last couple of days, I'm also very, very aware that one of the major risks that we all feel comes from this guy. So Rocky, while we're out there doing our homework, I had to get a selfie, and this was the guys at Wasafiri and Kenny were like, yeah, you got to get a selfie of Trump Tower. I nearly got arrested, but it was worth it. But one of its major findings was that the world has become more complex, and that, you know, I know it's a very familiar concept. But one of its most alarming findings is that we're insufficiently prepared. And I think this is significant. I think it has implications for all of us, regardless of your field or your market or your industry. And I think it begs the question, how do we as leaders operate effectively in the face of a global risk environment that looks something like this, right? And we're not even talking about the risks that you may feel are more present or more pressing upon your team and your organization. And I think as leaders, you could be forgiven for sometimes feeling a little bit overwhelmed by the demands of the day-to-day, right? You know, we've all been there. And so I very firmly believe that we've got to take things right back down to a personal level. So I want to come back here to this place where for me it all began, and standing on that mound of rubble. And since that point, there's been some pretty tough assignments. You know, places like Darfur and Rwanda and Congo and Ethiopia and others. And in that time, there's been some pretty dark moments. You know, those moments where you're like, oh God, why am I doing this? And maybe some of you in this room have had some of those moments over your careers. In fact, I know some of you have. Maybe we've all been there at some point. But for me, when I end up in one of these dark places, I got to end up back here. You know, I got to go back to that mound of rubble and that little child's toy, that little teddy bear, to remind me why it is that I do what I do. And so if I may, I'd like to pose this to you as one of my first questions to you is, as leaders facing complex problems, big and small, day in and day out, why do you do what you do? What matters to you? And I think it was David, in the very first session, he said, what calls you? Oh, what a fantastic question that is. And we could all answer it. I got a strong sense that within 3 minutes we could come back with that. And the thing for me is, maybe the question is not about what matters to you, it's how do you stay connected to that when it gets tough? Because that's when you need it, you know? And to what extent are you actively looking to unlock the energies and the passions and the talents of the people around you? Are you one of those people? Or are you passive and is it an assumption? And this for me is fundamental. It's the place to begin because I put it to you that complex environments are incredibly demanding and they're intolerant of leaders and leadership. And they force us to keep coming back to this place and this question. But let's fast forward in time now. We're going to head to a beautiful place. It's high up in the mountains. So we're going to fast forward 10 months to the back end of 2005. And this region in October was struck by a catastrophic natural disaster. And I'll buy a drink for anybody that can tell me where this was and what happened. No, Ian. He happened to be, cheat. No, not Nepal. Close. Bhutan? No. Peru? That's a long way away. It's not even close to Nepal. Kathmandu? So close. Kashmir? Bang, who said that? Thank you. Drink of your choice, young lady. Yeah. Well, it was in 2005, October, that an earthquake of 7.7 on the Richter scale struck about 150 kilometers north of the capital of Islamabad. And the extraordinary thing about that strike was that it lasted just 12 seconds. And you want to know how long 12 seconds lasts? Last this long. And in that 12 seconds, 79,000 people were killed, 85,000 people injured, and another 2.5 million people made homeless. I mean, you want to talk about volatility. Let's talk about the kind of volatility that affects millions of people's lives in 12 seconds. That blows my mind. And as if that wasn't enough, I mean, as you can see, the first snows of winter had started to fall. So for those people left without shelter and a means of keeping warm, you know, it was a real race against time. And at this time, this was my first proper assignment since working in Pakistan, seconded from Impact. I don't know what you were thinking, Dave. First time working with the United Nations. I don't know what they were thinking, that's for sure. Probably says something about their HR policies. And, you know, again, I was still totally green behind the ears, keen to save the world, so they packed me off, and Ian came along with me, and I got sent in one direction, him off to the other, and I went to Battleground, one of the hardest hit places. And they gave me this job title of Field Operations Coordinator, and nobody knew what that meant. And our job, as the International Organization for Migration, was to help provide emergency shelter for hundreds of thousands of families in the Allied Valley. But in reality, we were just 14 guys operating out of a couple of corrugated iron shacks in the mud. And you can see they were a wild cast of characters. This guy here, Ahmed, he was a retired Pakistani Army battalion commander. And he carried on as if he was still fighting the Indians in Kashmir. There was another guy, I think his name was Mohammed. He'd spent the 80s fighting the Russians in Afghanistan as part of the Mujahideen. So all those fancy books they've got on management and leadership and team building and stuff, you know, in the airport bookshops. It doesn't matter what they say, there is no easy way of managing a team like this. And one of my day jobs was to head up what we call these mountain remote assessment teams, the mountain rats, as IOM love to call it. And the thing about the UN is wherever you are, well, our job, I should say, was to head to the most inaccessible areas and just to find out how badly hit very, very remote communities were and what support they needed. And the thing about the UN, they've always got these dodgy old Ukrainian Mi-8 helicopters. And they're always held together with duct tape and string. And wherever you find them, you always find these dodgy old Ukrainian helicopter pilots. Is anybody here from Ukraine by any chance? No? That's a good thing, because we were lucky if they were sober, seriously. You know, we ended up in some pretty strange places. This is the day before GPS. We literally would appear in the wrong valley in a helicopter, and they're speaking Russian. We got the Pakistani loaders speaking Urdu. I'm speaking English. It was ridiculous. And just to give you an idea about some of the terrain that we're operating in and the daily commute, I mean, just amazing. You know, spectacular, but it just gives you some idea about what it was like for those communities way up in the mountains, right? And just in case you were wondering what would have happened if something bad had happened, and just, I think if you ever find, I don't know if you can see that, but it's basically a sort of a cardboard suitcase with survival kits strapped to the outside. If you ever find yourself on an aircraft and this is your survival kit, like, don't get on, that's my advice. And we never did find out what was in it. We always thought it was full of old bottles of Russian vodka or something. But thankfully nothing too bad ever happened. But we would end up in these amazing places. You know, 2 days walk from the nearest road, places that sometimes had never even seen Westerners before. And the hospitality, oh, just amazing. And so we'd spend our days with these people, and everyone had a story to tell. Like this little girl had lost her sister to rockfall. Everyone had been affected somehow by the earthquake. So we'd spend our days with these amazing communities, and at the end of each day we'd come back into that old Ukrainian helicopter and we'd head on back to our compound. And we were always confronted by scenes like this. Day after day, line after line of patient but increasingly anxious people. And I totally get it, but just stop for a second and put yourself in my shoes. And you just think you've got an impossible dilemma. Because our supply chain was totally broken and we had no idea what was coming in next and when we were going to get it. So what do? Do you hand out the supplies to the people that are knocking your door down every single day, or do you hold them back for the people that you're spending time with in the mountains, the ones who are going to be first hit and hardest hit when the snows come in? And of course it was our Pakistani staff that really bore the brunt of this. You know, they were the ones having to say no to their own people every single day. And in a horrible situation like that, there's no right answer. You know, and you can probably intellectualize or conceptualize the first 10 or 50 families or whatever. But when we're talking dozens, day in and day out, it really starts to wear you down. And I put it to you that this is one of the toughest tests of leadership. When you're in a damned if you do, damned if you don't kind of situation, and there's no rule book and there's no right answer, it really starts to strike right at the heart of who you are and what you believe in. And I had a chat about this with an old guy called Lars. He was a bit like the Jim of the UN system. Jim Bolt. He was your doppelganger. He was the head of one of the UN agencies. He had this 1,000-yard look in his eye. You know, he'd been around, seen it all. And one night over whiskey, I was talking to him about this, and he's like, Hamish, there is no right answer. But at the end of the day, you've got to be able to look yourself in the eye and know that you've done the best you could with what you had at the time. And that's going to take every ounce of belief you have, and that's a lousy situation. And I know that complex environments don't always look like the mountains of Pakistan or an earthquake zone, but they're full of competing interests and conflicting demands and options that often are all bad, where somebody's inevitably going to lose out. And I reckon that Lars makes a point that helps us navigate a way through those moments. But it means taking a long, hard look at yourself and knowing that at the end of the day, you've done the best you could with what you had at the time. And that is a lousy situation. And maybe it shouldn't have surprised us, but the people that we were turning away began to turn on us. And it started as like small-scale theft, as small stuff and minor pilfering. But when one of my team was badly beaten up by a group of men with shovels, all for a small sack of flour, we realized that things were getting out of hand. And so I made the decision that we should relocate our entire compound. And so a couple of days later, we relocated to the site of an engineering battalion. And we sat back after a couple of days hard labor and we assumed everything was going to be well. And you know what they say about assumptions, right? Because the thing that we feared most come to pass. And the weather came in. And in Pakistan, when the weather comes in hard and fast with driving sleet and rain, and just think for a second what it did to our compound and all those supplies that were out in the open. I mean, check this out. It was like something out of World War I. Total quagmire. And I came back and our guys were doing whatever they could to get those supplies out of the mud into trucks and tents and warehouses, whatever they could find. And it was chaos. You know, covered in mud, freezing cold, getting dark, they were exhausted. If ever there was a moment that screamed out for leadership. Like if ever there was a moment that I think screamed out for our boss, Jeff, to roll his sleeves up, get stuck in, create a bit of order from the chaos. I reckon this was his moment. But where was he? I looked high and low for Jeff around that camp. And eventually I found him, warm and dry, drinking a cup of green tea with the battalion commander. He was oblivious to what was going on. Like my jaw nearly hit the ground. And I put it to you, we lost a little bit of respect for Jeff as a leader that day. Because in a moment like that, you've got to ask yourself, how aware are you of the need for leadership? You know, I've become really fascinated by this concept of, I call it micro-leadership. Just that in every given day, there are dozens of little tiny opportunities to move the ball a bit further forward. And is Jojo here? No, he's not. Oh, there he is. Mate, you said it so much more poetically yesterday when, tell me that phrase again. The simple work in the great work. The small work in the great work. That's a beautiful way to put it. And we should never underestimate the value of the small work in the great work. So how aware are we of the need for leadership? And how aware are we of the kind of leadership that's required? And how do you respond if it's absent? Because this idea of leadership without action, it's just an idea, right? So I want to come back to that question that I asked right at the very beginning. What holds you back from the small work in the great work? And I'd love for you to take 30 seconds, whether it's on a piece of paper on the back of your hand, on the leg of your friend, just what's the one thing that when you think about your own leadership, what's the one thing that you struggle with? What's that one thing that renders everything else insignificant? I was thinking about this morning. I thought, shit, I can't ask this question unless I've thought about it for myself. And is Anna still here? Anna, we had dinner the other night, and we were talking about how often we feel like we're imposters or frauds. And I think the thing that holds me back is self-belief sometimes. That's my thing. Actually, I'd be really curious to know how often sometimes, and be honest here, stick your hand up if you have those moments where you're like, oh my God, should I be here? You know? So Anna, look at this bloody room of amazing people. You were like, what the hell am I doing here? I was saying the same thing, but look, we're all wrestling with the same shit. So you're not alone, you know? That's what it means to be part of this tribe. But that's my thing. I'd be curious to know if anybody would be so bold as to share their thing. Don't worry about the microphones and all that stuff, but anyone? Yes, ma'am.
I've put routine, not stepping back to break through, think, act.
Oh, routine. God, how often are we consumed and defined by routine? Thank you. Thank you. Anyone else? Yeah. Is it?
For me, sometimes believing in my own beliefs and having the courage to speak. That hold me back.
Having the courage to speak your beliefs. Thanks. Bob.
Inability to focus. I feel like sometimes I like spinning lots of plates, and I therefore am held back from really accomplishing.
Spinning a lot of plates. And sometimes we can be defined by that, right? And it just allows us to get off the hook of delivering, seeing through. Yes, ma'am.
I'm
Yeah. The tyranny of busyness. You know, and I'm sure we could just keep going around and we'd come up with a big long list. And I bet you if we put this list down on a piece of paper, we would step back and go, Jesus, you know what? They're entirely valid. You know, they're perfectly understandable in this day and age. They are really good reasons why perhaps in the moment we don't step up. And I'm sure that if you think back over your experiences, your careers, you can think about those times when you found a way beyond that. And maybe you can think about those times when somebody that perhaps you've least expected has managed to rise up beyond whatever it is that limits them. So for me, the question perhaps isn't what holds us back. It's like, what are we got to do to overcome that which holds us back? And I think there's something really important to recognize, that what holds you back, Eden, is going to be different from Alex, what holds you back. And so, you know, if we call ourselves leaders, what kind of responsibility do we have to create a culture where that's okay? You know, where you can recognize what your limitations are. And again, as my wonderful friend Kate says, our strengths are our limitations. So we should never be fooled that we are the perfect leader and tick all the boxes. And so do you create a culture where it's okay to recognize those things that hold us back? And do you create a culture that allows and permits people to step forward and offer a hand of support? Where's Jay? Last night, Jay, we were having a chat and we came up with this concept. Oh no, we were talking about this concept, this very African concept of Ubuntu. Some of you heard it. And roughly translated, it means my success is bound up in yours. And it's a principle we try to live by at Wasafiri. But to what extent are you genuinely creating and contributing to a culture? Even if it's the team of 3 people around you every day, or if it's an organization where people really understand what that means. I'll leave that question with you. Let's move to the other end of the planet, to a beautiful place. It's more water than land. It's been living a traditional way of life for thousands of years. And back in 2008, it was May, the largest cyclone in the country's history came to life off the coast of Myanmar. And it was about 9 o'clock in the evening, and Cyclone Nargis smashed a path all the way through from the southwest coast of the Irrawaddy Delta through to the capital of Yangon. And just the power of that storm. Ryan, if you can go ahead and just play this video clip. And this video was taken hundreds of kilometers inland from where it first made landfall. But it gives you a tiny little insight into the power of that storm. And I know you've seen clips like this from Irma, but have a think about the impact that it had on a very, very fragile society. And I took this photograph from where a village had once stood, you know, and there was nothing left but stumps of wood 6 inches out of the ground. You know, it had wiped that village totally off the map. And I think the story of that night is best told by children. And this was a drawing by a 5-year-old girl called Mao Myung that we worked with. And this is how she described the story of that night. And I think it gives you a tiny little insight. And at the time I was working in Rwanda, and I got a call from Save the Children. Again, working with impact. Still hadn't learned the lessons, Dave. And they needed a director for operations. And this gives you a map showing you the scale of the impact, population density, and if you overlay that with a list of the critical requirements, you get a sense of the scale of the damage. And you also get a sense of the scale of the requirements that hit us from the moment that we arrived. Getting enough trucks, enough planes, enough helicopters. We even had to rely on the Navy to help provide supplies in off the coast. I had slightly more of an idea, Dan, of what I was doing at this point, but not much more. But that wasn't it. You know, it was like it was scraping the barrel, getting any kind of boats, engines, life jackets. We had 14 CDMA phones to manage the entire operation with. We'd take whatever we could get. Some of those boats sank. We didn't lose anybody, but it was just a debacle. And of course, this was a regime under sanctions, so you couldn't just go to a bank to get cash. We had $2 million in cash in these boxes sitting in the office above ours. And we had long discussions around what to do with this stuff. And we thought, well, if you put a security guard, they know it's valuable. And so eventually we just had it shoved under some old blankets in the office above mine. And it was the wet season. Like, it was the wettest place I've ever been to. And that caused havoc with getting aid supplies around the country. And I got a whole new respect for working with elephants after working in Burma. You know, and this was a brutal regime. And we had riots in the streets with monks, and we had spies and informers. This guy, he'd been working in my logistics team until we found out he was also moonlighting for the intelligence agencies. And as if that wasn't enough, we even had an earthquake off the coast of the Andaman Islands. So we had to shut the entire operation down with 24 hours notice because of the threat of a tsunami. And by the end of this first month, you know, of working 20-hour days, you know, it sounds stupid, but it felt like we'd been through the hurricane ourselves. And I didn't realize it till I had a bit of a look at myself in the mirror. And you know that moment when you take a look at yourself and you don't really like what you see. I took a photo because I was totally exhausted, but more to the point, I was becoming dysfunctional. And I realized that I had hundreds of people working underneath me in far more difficult conditions than I was in. But it made me realize that we were running around like chickens with our heads chopped off, just trying to put out fire after fire after fire. And if we didn't figure out a smarter way in doing business, we were going to work ourselves into an early grave and have nothing to show for it. Because the deal was, we were trying to be everything to everyone. And you can imagine the pressure, you know, from survivors and the government, the media, your donors, yourselves. You want to do everything. But this moment was a bit of a blessing in disguise. Well, frankly, it was a kick up the arse, because I called a senior management team meeting and we had some pretty tough questions. Like, what impact were we really having? You know, we were spread so thin, just so thin. And what was it going to take to just stop being firefighters? And you know what they say, if everything's a priority, nothing's a priority. And over the next 3 months, we went to scale up to over 17 offices and about 1,000 people working right across the Delta. And by the end of August, we were providing aid to over 500,000 people. And I put it to you that having the collective courage, and it was a collective courage, to stand up and say no, was fundamental to being able to scale up so quickly and so effectively. So we're going to shift gear. We're going to go to the desert now. Very, very different time and place. And I know this is a horrible, horrible image. I'm not going to apologize for it. Because I think if you are following things in Darfur, you will have a tiny little insight into just how horrible things were. And back in 2009, President Bashir of Sudan was finally indicted by the criminal court for crimes against humanity. But that just made things worse. More fighting broke out down here in the south, and he responded by evicting half of the largest humanitarian agencies overnight. I mean, who does that? And it caused a crisis to turn into a catastrophe. I mean, just for the agencies left behind and hundreds of thousands of people. And I was called by an agency called Merlin that specialised in healthcare. And they desperately needed to scale up their response, particularly down here in the south and the southeast, for communities affected by the fighting. And the living conditions were pretty rough. It was not like the Empire Hotel, where we sampled some cocktails on the rooftop last night. There was no power, no running water. We didn't even have glass in the windows, which is not good in a place of sandstorms. And it was hot. It was the hottest place I've ever been, and I'm from Dubbo. It was the only place I've ever gotten malaria, and I don't recommend malaria. And this ladder, seriously, was one of our security measures. So if the bad guys came in through the front gate, we'd be up and over the ladder into the neighbour's yard. I mean, that's the kind of place it was. And we were operating out of a small village called El Dain, the Dubbo of Darfur. Let's call it that, to coin a phrase. So El Dain is here. Not that that matters. It's in the middle of nowhere. And it was a 4-hour drive through the bush to our sub-office, an even smaller village called Adilla. And we used to call that drive Carjack Alley. It's a 4-hour drive, but there was all sorts of threats of kidnapping and carjacking by these rebel groups. And they'd steal an NGO. So if you donate to NGOs, I hope you do, they're wonderful causes. I know folks from World Vision are here. But these guys would steal the NGO's Land Cruisers, and they'd cut the back off them and mount a .50 caliber machine gun. And then they would roam the desert like Mad Max. And so there were real threats. I had colleagues who had all sorts of issues. Thankfully, nothing ever happened to us on those drives out to Adilla. But as you can see, it was a bit of a complex environment. And I have to say that if this, preparing for a road trip and not knowing if you're going to get kidnapped or carjacked is a fantastic kind of introduction to working in a world of uncertainty. But it was all good, eventually. And one of the first things I did that when I arrived was to call a large meeting with all of our staff. And we had about 100 staff. And you know what it's like. Those first impressions with your teams, they're so important, particularly in a place like Darfur. And all the formalities went well, the cups of tea and the Thanksgiving and the bowls of sweets and all that sort of stuff. But as we drew things to a close, there was a young lady that came up to me, and she was heavily pregnant. And she was just really anxious. She just wanted to know that she had a job to come back to after she'd given birth. And as we talked, more people came around. And I began to hear all sorts of different anxieties and concerns and issues, and the doctors hadn't been paid, and the drivers, they needed the car servicing, all this sort of stuff. And as the conversation drew to a close, one of the guards came up to me. And in Darfur, if you're a guard, you're probably from one of the kind of lower status tribes. You'll tend to go toward the end of these sort of formal functions. And he took me by the hand, and he led me around the back. And his colleagues had gathered around a fire. And they'd prepared this little high chair. And he wanted me to sit in. I said, no, it's fine, I'll sit in the circle. And he said, no, he insisted. He wanted me to sit in this chair. And I was like, no. We had this funny little back and forwards. And eventually, I just sat with these guys in the dirt and listened to what they had to say. And they wanted small stuff. They wanted batteries for their headlamp, and they wanted repairs to the roof of the hut. They wanted rain jackets and stuff that's trivial by your standards and mine. And so I listened to these guys until they had nothing left to say. And as we got up to leave, one of them came up to me and he said, thank you, Mr. Hamish. Nobody's ever sat with us before. And it just sort of dawned on me that I'd probably been the first big boss to ever take the time to sit with these guys in the dirt and listen to what they had to say. And in that moment, I realized you can't take the responsibility for leadership for granted. Like you gotta earn that right to lead. It's not an entitlement. And in a place like Darfur, that in itself is a complex thing. I use the word trust, but it's trust and relationships and setting expectations and delivering on your promises, all that sort of stuff. But the litmus test for me was whether or not I could look these guards in the eye and know that they had our backs. So here's the thing. So 2 weeks later, we're having a meeting. There's a knock on the door. And one of the guards comes in and he said, Mr. Hamish, we've got some news. We think there might be some bad people coming to town. There could be trouble. And of course, this is a dilemma, right? We're running healthcare programs in the entire region. What do you do? But we couldn't take the risk. So we packed up, we left the next day, and 24 hours later, a group of these guys on these technicals, they came into the town, they shot the place up, and they burned the market to the ground. And the moral of the story is these guards have been looking out for us. Like they had our backs. So it doesn't matter how aware of your landscape, your context you are. You might have all the data and the statistics and the analysis, but have you earned your right to lead? Do you have a license to operate and make decisions that affect the lives of others? Now, a couple of months later, I was starting to get pretty comfortable in the role. I had my feet under the table. I sort of had a sense I knew what was going on. I knew how to handle myself. And even though we were operating out of the Dubbo of Darfur, you could never escape the all-seeing, all-knowing eye of the head office. I don't know how many of you work in head offices, but we began to get these memos and these directives telling us to really restrict our movements because they felt that security was getting worse. But we were the guys in the trenches, right? We were in the front lines. We knew what was going on. And for all we knew, these guys were just sitting on the banks of the Nile drinking cups of tea. And after about a week or so of this, being confined to camp, we started to get a bit of cabin fever. So one evening, we made a cunning plan to escape. And you see, the only other international in town was a guy called Paul. And Paul lived on the other side of town, and he was the only guy that had a few beers for about 1,000 kilometers. So one evening, as the dusk was coming in. Me and one of our nurses headed off on the back of a donkey cart. It's a great way to travel. It's very eco-friendly. And about 10 minutes later, we come across to the main intersection in Aldane. And just on the other side of the intersection, there was Paul's compound. And we're just about to cross from the back of the donkey cart, and a single gunshot rings out. And in Darfur, everyone's got an AK-47. So a bit of gunfire, it's cool. But the next second, all hell broke loose. And a massive gunfight broke out right across that intersection. And you got no idea how fast you can move until you hear a few bullets zipping past your head. Tom, I'm sure you know what that's like. I bet you weren't on a donkey cart at the time though, my friend. I piled off that thing into some little corrugated iron shack. I bet you didn't have corrugated iron shacks for cover either. You know, you're probably getting in some armored battle tank. We had no idea what was going on, but I did grab a little audio recording, and I want to play it for you. Ryan, if you could just click that little audio sign down the bottom right. Right, so this is all kicking off. We're in some little corrugated shack, no idea, and at this point the phone rings. And I know, right? And it was Shambul, our logistics officer, and he's like, Mr. Hamish, I'm just ringing to let you know there's a small gunfight taking place downtown. He said, but don't worry, it's in the restricted area, so just stay where you are in the compound, you'll be perfectly fine. And he was a very polite guy, and at that point there was a bit more shooting going on behind me. He said, Mr. Hamish, I believe I can hear the sound of gunfire. And I said, I know, it's all around me. And he goes, but where are you? And I said, I'm downtown in the middle of it all with Emily. And there was this kind of pause for a second, and just sunk in, and he's like, Alhamdulillah, Mr. Hamish, do not let any harm come to Miss Emily. And then he finished with Khamar, which, Jojo, I'm probably butchering my Arabic as well, mate. But I'm led to believe that it means something like donkey. You idiot. And as soon as the gunfire had stopped, we were across that intersection into Paul's compound. And as they say in Australia, Sean, those first couple of beers didn't even touch the sides. And there was no denying it. Like, as soon as the dust had settled, like, this had been a bit of a serious near miss. And you can imagine the kind of conversations that I started to have with my friends in their ivory tower in Khartoum. And they were very keen to know how it was that one of their new managers had been caught on a donkey cart in a restricted area with one of the senior nurses in a small gunfight. It was not a pleasant conversation. But it really hit home when I had a chat with my boss. And he said, Hamish, I know you're new here, but let's be honest. Why would anyone want to be led by someone who's going to go and break the rules and put people's lives at risk? Oh, you imagine having that conversation with your new boss? And he was totally right. When I reflected on this, I'd become a little bit lazy, a little bit complacent. In a place like Darfur, for God's sake, you know, I'd become arrogant if I was totally honest. And you can't avoid the questions of, like, you know, he was totally right. Who was I to go and break the rules and put people's lives at risk all for a couple of warm beers? So how do you avoid getting lazy or complacent when you're in your comfort zone? And where do you draw the line when there's all sorts of temptations just to push it a little bit too far? And then fundamentally, why would anyone want to be led by you? That's what I want to know. That's a humbling experience right there. But I want to pause. And I want to hand things over to you. I've been sharing a bunch of stories that have been powerful for me, and they've yielded all sorts of insights that have affected who I am. And I want to give you the chance, it won't be very long, 5 or 10 minutes max, just to pair up, just with somebody next to you, and just to reflect on some sort of an experience. It could be an experience in adversity. It could be some other kind of powerful encounter. But for some reason, it's impelled you to reflect upon who you are as a leader and what you bring to your leadership practice. So I want to give you that opportunity. So just take 5 or 10 minutes. Just sit with somebody next to you and just have a little conversation, and maybe at the end. I am curious to know if anybody, I'm just going to sort of wander through here, so don't mind me. I'm just wondering if anybody will feel like they would like to share anything that came up from that conversation. Is there anybody that feels like they'd like to share an insight?
Thank you. And But as things have unfolded in our country, I felt it was urgent for me to. And I think that, speaking of micro leadership, that it's what you do in small rooms that really matters, the rooms that you have access to. So I started speaking up. And a friend of mine who talked about putting your rudder down so that people know where you stand. And once you put your rudder down, it becomes easier. And so the first time I did it, I was sweating and my heart was racing. And I thought I had very much alienated myself from people. But people became accustomed to that was what was going to come out of my mouth. And so then also reflecting on my leadership and working with my students, and one of the projects we worked on was telling stories of my students who were refugees and students who had experienced police brutality. And I worked with 2 other artists who were artists of color, who were my collaborators, and I was very mindful of when I needed to step back and very aware of my whiteness in that space, and that my job was to create space for a platform, but to not dominate the space. So I constantly am reflecting in my leadership role as a teacher of where it is important for me to check myself to create space for other people.
Thank you. What a lovely story. And I love your phrase, it's what we do in the small rooms that matters. Oh, I'm going to write that down. That is awesome. You know, again, it's a poetic way of putting this idea of micro leadership. Thank you very much, Noelle.
Thank you.
Is there anybody else that feels the urge to share anything that came out of that? And it's okay if you don't. You see, you're a tough act to follow. That's the problem. They've all seen your video, like, how on earth? You've only yourself to blame here, Noelle. You know what I think is really cool is just, it sounds like it's really deeply embedded in your practice as a leader to reflect on the experiences that you have, you know, to really be intentional about the choices you're making. And I think that really speaks to this idea of the fact that our truth lives in our experience. But it requires, you know, I'm fixated on this idea that we're totally saturated by prescriptions about what leadership should look like and what we should be as leaders. You know, there's all sorts of bloody competency frameworks and toolkits and top 10 lists and all this sort of stuff, and maybe there's value in that. But don't ever be fooled to think that's where the answers are. You know, like leadership development, our own leadership growth, I think is hard, and it's messy, and it's painstaking, and it doesn't stop. And it's all in here, and it ain't out there. And I think your story highlights that beautifully. Yeah, thank you. So with that in mind, I think we should move on. I think a lot of people probably don't know this, but in December 2013, a 2-year-old boy died of a mysterious illness in rural Guinea. And 5 months later, the very first case of Ebola was reported in Sierra Leone. And just like the World Economic Forum said, we weren't prepared. Like, nobody saw that coming. And 5 months after that, the numbers were off the charts. You know, and by October, November 2014, I should say, about 100 people a day were contracting Ebola. It spread like wildfire right across West Africa. And you'll remember it destroyed the health systems. You know, health workers were dying in droves. People were being left on the streets, and they couldn't dig enough graves fast enough. And you've got to remember, this was a virus that killed people within 24 to 48 hours of onset. There was no vaccine, no cure, and the UN at the time, I mean, the whole world went into a total panic, and rightfully so. The UN declared it the greatest threat to global security at the time. And back in Sierra Leone, the whole country went onto a war footing. And they had to. They deployed police and military to the streets, and they built treatment facilities right in the middle of the bush. But the real ground zero, the real front line in the war on Ebola, certainly as far as Sierra Leone was concerned, was back here in the slums of Freetown. And I've seen slums before, but I've never seen squalor like this. And the tragedy for those people living amongst this is unreal. And of course, it had totally destroyed the health systems. And so the government had to work with the UK government to come up with an entirely new organizational structure to respond to Ebola. And they created these things called District Ebola Response Centers, DIRCs. And each District Ebola Response Center was charged with coordinating the response and all the pillars of the response, from surveillance to burials to security and the whole lot. And each of them was headed up by a Sierra Leonean appointed by the president and a team leader from the UK. And I spent 3 months working for the Western Area District Ebola Response Centre in Freetown. So 1.5 million people and all of those slums there. And what I really want to do in about 3 minutes is try to immerse you into what it felt like in that reality. So let's do that. Let's see what happens. And of course, before you deploy into an environment like this, you always get a whole bunch of briefings. So this is one of the slides that I got. And this was the DIRC structure. So we had about 150 people up here in the coordination, the command center. You got all the pillars of the response here, you get about 1,500 people. And Dan, you'll be very familiar with these kind of organizational charts, beautiful. On the ground in the community, we had about 3,000 or 4,000 people, we never really knew, all volunteering for various parts of various pillars, various programs. And so this was the DIRC. This was the Western Area Command Center. It was about a room this size, was a converted gymnasium, and it was surrounded wall to wall with whiteboards and flip charts and maps and figures, and on any given day it was total mayhem. You could have 80 people in there, you could have 280 people in there. You know, and it was phone calls, and it was meetings, and it was VIPs and media, and it was shouts and arguments, and sometimes we even had a couple of fights literally on the floor of this place. And it didn't matter how much data we had about Ebola. It was fundamentally a complex problem, because it was a problem of human behaviors and social norms and customs. So despite all the data, we didn't know what was going to hit us from one day to the next, whether it was massive food distributions for communities that have been particularly badly affected, quarantining entire households if somebody had been infected, the decontamination of anything that had come close to somebody who had been infected by Ebola. Everything had to be destroyed. Setting up, relocating, collapsing treatment facilities, managing huge logistics fleets, and of course, responding to outbreaks. This is the Connaught Hospital, and it's the largest hospital in Sierra Leone. And while I was there, a patient transmitted Ebola to a health worker and they both died. We had to shut that whole hospital down. And just spare a moment to think about the people that don't have Ebola. Pregnant women, car crash victims, cancer patients. Where do they go when you've shut the country's largest hospital down? You know, and it was everything else and more, you know, that you just couldn't imagine that you had to respond to day in, day out. So even though we had this nice, neat organizational chart that we deployed with, on any given day, we were never entirely sure who was coordinating what. Never entirely sure what our pillar teams were doing, where they were, what they were up to. We had to contend with the personalities and the politics and the craziness of the Sierra Leonean government and the ministries, the community, and of course the international community, the media, the UN, the military, the whole lot. And in the middle of all of this, I was one of 2 or 3 people trying to coordinate a response for 1.5 million people. I mean, what the hell? And how do you drive change in an environment like that? It was totally ridiculous. I mean, this was an organization that had been built in a time of complete crisis. I mean, we hadn't had the time to build all the structures and the systems, you know, that we rely on for functional systems and organizations. You know, this was literally like taking off in a plane while it was still being built. And so on any given day, I found myself like, what's the battle I got to fight right now? You know, how do I fight that battle? Where do I get traction and influence? And you quickly realize in this kind of environment, no single person or organization has got the power to drive change alone. And when you realize that, it changes everything. And I put it to you that complex environments, that is the deal. Whether you're the president or the commanding general of the military, you haven't got the power to drive change. Particularly in an environment that is so volatile, so dynamic, a constant state of flux. You can't rely on all of the things that we do rely on day in and day out, you know, the decision-making structures and all the conventional systems by which organizations function. And for me, I realized that my leadership challenge, therefore, was driving change through others.
Yeah.
And now that's a messy business, because it means you've got to sit down with people you don't like, people that you don't understand, people with competing and conflicting agendas and priorities and politics. And you never really know if you're actually driving change. But it's fundamentally about partnerships and collaboration and coordination and cohesion and all of these great words. They sound great, but you know the messiness in practice. And so what that meant on a day-to-day basis was, how do we create an organization that has like an adaptive capacity at a tactical level? You know, small teams that were empowered to respond to whatever was coming up. You know, come back, learn, reconfigure, respond all over again, so that we could have some sort of strategic capacity to look up and out. What was the next train coming down the tracks that was going to smash us, even if that was 2 weeks down the track? Malaria, monsoons, political policy changes, military reconfigurations, shutdown of schools, the whole lot. And in spite of the chaos and the confusion and the arguments and the mayhem, the numbers speak for themselves. You know, we went from a peak of 600 to 700 cases a week to, by the time I finished, less than 2 or 3. You know, it was the most remarkable case of collective action on a national scale that I've ever been part of. It was just an extraordinary privilege, despite the chaos and the mayhem. But let's come on to my final couple of moments that I want to share with you. Actually, it's probably a good moment to just check in on people's energy levels. Kathleen, how's that blood? You know, like, if you want to do any, yeah, start busting out some push-ups. yeah. Try not to be too distracting, but look, this is your moment. If you feel the need for a bit of a pump session, you know, go for it. But if you've been to Afghanistan, you'll know that it's a wild place, you know, much like its people. This just gives you a sense of the kind of environment, the kind of terrain that you're in. And one of the many crazy things about Afghanistan is that it's just a 3-hour flight from Dubai, like the Disneyland of Dubai, ski slopes and shopping malls, and then you're on the streets of Kabul. Like, the contrast is unlike anything on the planet. It is truly ridiculous. And back in 2009 and 10, this is when the military and civilian surge was really starting to reach a peak. And the conflict was really starting to intensify in a few areas. And this is a province called Helmand. And at the time, I was invited, I was still in Darfur, and I got invited by the British government to come and head up a large counter-narcotics program. Now, I don't know anything about narcotics, and I certainly don't know the first thing about how to counter them, but I thought I'd give it a go. How hard can it be? In hindsight, don't do it. That's probably my biggest lesson from this particular story. Now, one of the things that I didn't know, which would have been probably some useful information before I deployed, was what the military strategy looked like for the campaign in Afghanistan. And now this is what I picked up later on, and I just reflect on this, and there's so many different ways to interpret this. I mean, perhaps gives you some insight as to why it didn't work out so well. I think, had I known this, I probably shouldn't have gone out there. But another thing I didn't realize at the time was, even though it's very, very easy to get to Kabul, getting to my head office, getting to our forward operating base in Helmand, was a totally different adventure. You got to get on some military cargo plane at 3 o'clock in the morning. You get off in one of the largest British bases in the desert. It's like Mars. This place was busier than Heathrow Airport at the time. Seriously. And on the day that I arrived, the Taliban shot down a helicopter on its approach. You can see the smoke up there, and so that was my welcome to Afghanistan moment. But in spite of that, the roads were so insecure, you still had to take helicopters everywhere. And Ryan, if you just go ahead and roll this clip here. I just want to give you a bit of a sense as to what it's like in these military helicopters. And they always leave the door open. I don't know why they do this, but you've got some guy with a 50 caliber machine gun, and you're strapped in, you're hoping you're not going to get thrown out with the jet wash and this incredible kind of speed and power of these things, and you're flying low and hard and fast over the lower Helmand River Valley, and it's very exciting, but it's also a little bit terrifying at the same time. And so, even after we'd arrived, we still hadn't finished the journey. You know, I'm still trying to get down to this bloody forward operating base, and you've got to get in these giant armoured trucks to make the final journey. And it was so insecure where we were that everywhere we travelled, you had to have an armed close protection officer. And this is my man Paul. He's ex-Special Forces, and he's a very handy guy to have around in those tricky meetings. Highly recommend it. And so after about 3 days of travelling, I finally got to this place and had a chance to meet the team that I was going to manage for this counter-narcotics program. And there'd been a bit of media about these guys, and they'd called them extreme agriculturalists, which is pretty dubious. And these guys were pretty dubious. They were a total ragtag bunch. I mean, there was a guy, Roy there, used to play rugby for the South Africans. Derek had been a mercenary in Zimbabwe. Emily, she works for the British Cabinet Office, which is a bit like the equivalent of the White House. She'd hate it if I was showing this picture. There's Mohammed there, he's got a live RPG warhead. And there's me, 3 days in, fresh from being a humanitarian in Darfur, and I'm like, who the hell are these guys? You know, what am I doing here? I felt like that weird kid at a school dance. And it didn't seem like these guys were going to cut me any slack if it got tough. But I just want to digress for a moment, because I want to give you, as if that wasn't surreal enough, I want to give you an insight into just how surreal a place it was in Helmand and to come into this space. Within about a week, I got a call from my boss, Archie Lightfoot, and he said, Hamish, you need to get up to a district called Sangin, because we've got some issues with the district governor. We reckon he's stealing aid supplies. So get up there with the provincial governor's advisor and let him know that we're onto him. I'm like, all right, I'm up for that. So here he is. Here's the district governor of Sangin. And Sangin was the most notorious district in all of Helmand. And this guy is the district governor. He looks a little bit like an Afghan Santa Claus, if you ask me. And just behind him, this is his election campaign poster. So he's obviously a very democratic gentleman. And I took this photograph here because you can see what I'm standing on, not because I like the decor, but underneath the carpet, there's the entrance to his basement, which is where he used to put people that didn't agree with his policies. He was a nasty piece of work. So the provincial governor's advisor decided, right, we need to have a public confrontation with his gang of henchmen the next day in a public place. Let them know we're not going to tolerate this. So we decided that we would meet on the grounds of the school. And here they are. And as soon as you meet, like, everybody's starting to come. I mean, this is all very exciting. And this big guy up here, this is the district governor's brother. This guy on the right is wearing a stolen Afghan police uniform. How about that? And he's the district governor's brother. And we knew that they were all armed. You know, they were all carrying weapons. It was probably like that university your husband works in, wasn't it? I bet it was. And we didn't know, like, so we're all wearing flak jackets. We didn't know if anything, you know, and the people were starting to come, and we didn't know what might kick off or whatever. And just as an extra insurance policy, in case these guys did anything stupid, you remember my man Paul? Oh, there he is. He's taken up a firing position behind all of these sacks of flour or whatever it was. And I just had to take a photograph of that moment, because where the hell on the planet are you having a meeting where the guy with the gun is covering the guys with guns that you're meeting with? It was just surreal. I'm a week into this place and suddenly I'm wearing body armor and there's Paul with an assault rifle trained on some guys. It was totally ridiculous. But there was no time to get your feet under the table. This wasn't like Darfur. You had to get straight into it. And within 2 weeks, we were running convoys across all 8 districts, most of which were actively controlled by the Taliban. No time to get your feet wet. And lo and behold, I got a call at 5 o'clock in the morning. One of the convoys had broken down about 50 kilometres south of Lashkargah. And of course, sod's law, they didn't have the air cover, we didn't have ground transport, they didn't have the supplies and the tools and all that sort of stuff. So Big Roy, one of these extreme agriculturalists, he said, all right, I'll take a truck down, I'll go and sort it out, I know how to fix this stuff. And so I made the call and sent him off into the night, and away he went. And I got a call about an hour later, and Big Roy had hit a roadside bomb. He'd hit an IED. And as you can see, the car was totally destroyed, but he survived within an inch of his life. And we got lucky twice that day because the convoy managed to sort itself out, and eventually they got away unscathed as well. So if there was a silver lining from this moment, I mean, it was that we had a forensic review to figure out what the hell had gone wrong. And we made damn sure that that never happened again. Damn it, and it never did. But what I realized very, very clearly and very quickly is that Helmand, and operating in a place like Helmand, it's like operating, Alex mentioned this on the first day. Do you remember when he said, when decisions get to me, there's no black or white anymore. It's like you're always operating in the grey space. Do you remember that? I thought that was a fantastic insight, because operating in Helmand was all about operating in the grey space. And what that means, of course, is that you don't have control over events on the ground. You certainly don't have the complete information picture. And I dare say that's what it's like operating in many complex environments. But it also means you better get pretty comfortable with this idea of risk and failure, because it's inevitable. Whether it's yours, other people outside of your control. And I love this idea of wisdom. And the Oxford English Dictionary defines wisdom as the soundness of an action or decision with regard to the application of experience and good judgment. And I think that's a fine articulation of the qualities required to operate effectively in the grey space. But the only problem is, and Will Rogers said this, good judgment comes from experience, but experience comes from bad judgment. And I thought that was a pretty good articulation of how I was operating at the time. And so pretty quickly you realize, like, my job, my challenge was to figure out the grey space, to navigate it, to hone the craft, to hone the practice of being in that space, trying to minimize the risks of failure, the consequences, particularly when people's lives are on the line. So how well equipped are you to operate in that grey space? How do you hone that judgment really, really quickly? Now, I spent most of my time in a district called Musakala, just to the northwest of Sangin. And Musakala was notorious for being a stronghold of the Taliban and a real centre for poppy production, so some pretty interesting characters there. And I want to focus on one particular incident that happened in August 2010. And in August, it was really the peak of the summer fighting season, as they would call it. And on this particular day, we were having an event to bring together the US Marine Corps, the Marines ran the base, with the Afghan army and the Afghan police. Bit of a relationship and sort of planning event. Now, at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, I'd left to come and collect the district governor, because he was going to come and attend the event. And we were coming up at about 3 o'clock in the afternoon up this sort of dusty road here. And the photo was taken from this residential block called the White House. And just behind the White House, there's this building here, which was a detention facility, which is where they used to keep Taliban prisoners. So about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, I'm coming up and with a different bodyguard, a guy called Andy at the time. And what you can't see just off to the shot here, off to the side, is a big helicopter landing site. And as we walked up this hill, a huge helicopter was taken off. And as you saw, you know, it's incredibly noisy and it's loud and dusty and it's a bit confusing. And in the sort of dust cloud, a colleague of mine called Ken McGonigal ran up to this group of Marines that were standing there. And all I heard him say was RPG, which stands for Rocket Propelled Grenade. And I kind of stood there for a second. And then Andy grabs me by the shoulders and he turns me around and he shoves me back down the hill. And just as we started going down the hill, I heard 3 shots fired behind me. And what I didn't realize, what nobody knew at the time, was that there'd been 3 Taliban prisoners in this detention facility. But instead of escaping, they decided to stage a suicide attack on the base. So we came on down to our little compound at the bottom of the hill. And Ryan, if you just go ahead and play this clip, it's a 5-second clip. So this is Angus, he's our political officer. And there's Wayne, who's our other close protection officer. He's grabbing his weapon and his radio and his body armour. And at this point, it all kicked off. And about 100 yards back up this dusty hill, this huge gunfight broke out right up around the White House. And we couldn't stay where we were because it was insecure. You know, there was no protection. And so we sort of made a run for about another 80, 100 yards down to the kind of inner cordon, you know, the inner sanctum of the HQ. And we sat there and we could communicate by radio, but we didn't know what was going on outside. And Ryan, just play this clip as well. And we could just sit there and we could communicate this. We're having a chat with Alayar, who was one of our Afghan interpreters, and he was pinned down in the White House. And Wayne at this point said, right, I'm going to go and try to get Alayar and Nasratullah and the guys out of this place. And he came back about 5 minutes later and he said, look, the firing is way too intense. I can't even get close to these guys. So we just had to sit on the radio and say, Aliyah, stay where you are. You're going to be all right. And after about 45 minutes, the firing stopped. And this is a room where they killed the last of the attackers. And you can't see it, but in around those bullet holes, there were pencil drawings of people shooting up at helicopters. So these guys had been planning this. And at this point, the battalion commander came in, Lieutenant Colonel Mike Manning. And he had some blood on his uniform. And he said, guys, I've got to tell you, Ken's been shot and killed. And they killed like 2-3 other Marines that day. And it shouldn't ever have happened. It shouldn't have happened. And that, that hits you like a thunderbolt. And it changes your world, And we just couldn't believe it. You're like, what the hell was this all about? And you guys trained for this. I'm a bloody humanitarian. What the hell is this all about, Tom? And, I got to say, I got to owe Andy a debt of gratitude, because if he hadn't have been there, I probably just would have walked straight up in the middle of this thing. And that day could have turned out very, very differently. And in the aftermath of something like this, everybody responds differently. Some people, they've got to go and party hard and they just got to get it out of their system. And other people, they've got to really get personal and just process it. But for all those military and those civilians, they couldn't get on that flight and head on back to Dubai. They had to get up the next day and get on with it and do what they'd been doing the day before and the day before that. And that's an incredible test of character. To be able to sustain yourself and to support others when it gets really tough. Yeah, it's incredible. And Rocky, you son of a bitch, you knew this was going to happen. Oh, man. And call it what you like, spirit or grit or resilience, it doesn't really matter. You don't get it in a PowerPoint presentation. It's very hard to train for, but it's fundamental, I think, to enduring and surviving and possibly thriving in really complex environments. Because like I said right from the very beginning, these are the kind of places that are so intolerant of leaders and leadership. But it's fundamental to looking after yourself and the people around you. And so I offer you my questions. These are my questions based on what I see, in the world and what I see when I look in the mirror. But they don't count. So you can put your phones down. You can stop writing them down. I'm not going to email them out to you. You're not going to get them. Because these are my questions based on my realities, my experiences, and my truth. The answers don't lie in here. I do hope that my story has helped encourage you to continue your own leadership journeys, to continue digging deeply into that messy grey space of your own leadership experience, because that's where the gems are. That's where your truth lies. And I've got Kate to thank for that. So thank you for sharing my journey, and I want to wish you all the very best on yours. And I want to close with just a brief slideshow to some music, just to allow you some time to reflect on that.
All that we needed was right. The threshold is breaking tonight. Open to everything, happy and sad. Seeing the good when it's all going bad. Seeing the sun when I can't really see. Hoping the sun will at least look at me. Focus on everything better today. All that I needed I never could say. Hold on to people that's slipping away. Hold on to this while it's slipping away. All that we needed tonight are people who love us and light. to everything happy and sad, seeing the good when it's all going bad, seeing the sun when I can't really see, hoping the sun will at least look at me. Focus on everything better today. All that I needed I never could say. Hold on to people, they're slipping away. Hold on to this while it's slipping away. So long, so long. Open to everything happy and sad, seeing the good when it's all going bad, seeing the sun when I can't really see, hoping the sun will at least look at me. Focus on everything better today. All that I needed I never could say.